Imagine waking up to find that your deepest fears, the ones you bury in your dreams, have crept into the real world. What if the artwork you created, the strokes you painted late into the night, were no longer your own? This is exactly what Ethan Caldwell, a freelance painter, is facing. Something sinister is happening in his studio, something beyond comprehension. It all began innocently enough, but now, each night is a descent into a living nightmare, where the boundaries between his imagination and reality are dissolving. Tonight, we'll follow Ethan as he confronts an invisible presence that not only completes his paintings, but twists them into terrifying premonitions of a future that hasn't happened yet. Ethan's studio was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself for hours, paintbrush in hand, translating emotions into color and texture. The old building where his studio was located had its own charm, a mixture of the past and forgotten dreams. The cracked walls, the dusty windows that let in beams of moonlight, and the eerie quietness of the night, it all set the perfect mood for his creative process. But there was something about this place that went beyond charm, a lingering presence, a chill that settled in the air, that made the hairs on his neck stand on end if he stayed too late. It was a late autumn evening when Ethan first noticed something was wrong. He had left a painting unfinished, a simple abstract of swirling reds and blacks, evoking chaos and passion. Exhausted, he had decided to leave the rest for the next day. But when he returned, the painting had changed. The swirls had been reshaped into something more distinct, a figure, a shadow, standing at the center of the storm. The figure seemed to stare back at him, despite having no facial features. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as he moved closer, running his fingers over the dried paint. It was his work, his colors, his strokes, but not his design. Who, or what, had touched his canvas? He tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion or a lapse in memory. Perhaps he had painted it without realizing. But that night, as he lay in bed, sleep did not come easily. The studio's silence had followed him home, the image of the shadowy figure burning behind his eyelids. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of his studio. Only it wasn't quite the same. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows moved of their own accord, and there was the figure again, standing over his easel, brush in hand, painting furiously. Ethan could hear it, the soft scratch of the bristles, the rhythmic strokes, the whisper of something unintelligible. He tried to move closer, to see who or what was painting, but his body was paralyzed, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He awoke with a start, the sound of the brushstrokes still echoing in his ears, a cold sweat drenching his body. He told himself it was just a dream, nothing more. But the next day, when he returned to his studio, his heart sank. The painting was no longer abstract. It had taken shape completely. A dark alley, with the shadowy figure standing at the end, its head turned as if watching, waiting. A chill spread down his spine, and a creeping dread began to settle in his gut. There was something inherently wrong about the figure, something that filled him with a deep, unshakable fear. "Is this some kind of joke?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. But the silence that answered him was heavy, almost mocking. He searched the studio, every corner, every nook, looking for signs of an intruder. But there was nothing. No broken locks, no footprints, just the stale, unmoving air and the painting that seemed to come alive under his gaze. It was then that Ethan realized this was only the beginning. Something had entered his world, something that did not belong, and it was using his hands, his art, to speak. If you're curious about what comes next, what Ethan will discover as he delves deeper into this twisted mystery, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story leads. And if you have any theories about what's behind this eerie transformation, drop them in the comments below. Let's unravel the terror together. It all began with a dream so vivid, so disconcertingly real, that Ethan could still feel the chill of the studio's air on his skin when he awoke. It was late, far past midnight, and the only light in his studio was the faint glow of a single candle, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance along the cracked walls. In the dream, Ethan found himself standing in front of his easel, staring at an unfinished painting. But something was different. He wasn't alone. He could hear at first a soft rustle, like fabric brushing against a floor, and then the unmistakable sound of bristles against canvas. The noise echoed through the darkened room, a rhythmic scratching that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He tried to move, to turn and see who was there, but his body felt heavy, as if it were made of stone. Fear rooted him in place. His eyes locked on the easel as unseen hands worked feverishly. The brush moved with purpose, creating strokes that were precise yet chaotic, and with each movement, a new image took form on the canvas. The scent of turpentine filled the air, sharp and almost suffocating, mingling with a strange, metallic odor that made Ethan's stomach twist. It was then that he saw what was being painted, a scene from his own memory, twisted and darkened. It was an alley he used to walk through on his way home, but the colors were wrong, deep reds that bled into inky blacks, and a shadowy figure standing at the far end, its face obscured, its posture unnaturally still. As he watched, the figure seemed to come to life, its head turning ever so slightly, as if it were aware of him, watching him in return. The candlelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the room, and Ethan could swear he heard something, a whisper, so faint it was almost lost in the scratch of the brush. The whisper wasn't clear, but it sounded like his name, stretched out, distorted, as though spoken from a great distance. The sense of familiarity was overwhelming. He had walked that alley 100 times, but never had it seemed so menacing, so drenched in malice. The colors bled together, the scene warping as if the canvas itself were breathing, expanding and contracting with each stroke of the brush. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine, his body rigid with a sense of dread so intense it felt as though the room were closing in on him. And then, suddenly, he was no longer watching. He was in the painting, the walls of the studio fading away, replaced by the cold, damp brick of the alley. The ground beneath his feet was slick, the air heavy with fog that clung to his skin. He could hear the distant echo of footsteps, the same rhythmic brushing, sound now transformed into the crunch of gravel and leaves. Ethan turned, his heart pounding, and there, at the end of the alley, was the figure, closer now, its head still cocked to the side, as if studying him. The fear was suffocating. Ethan tried to call out, but no sound came, his voice caught in his throat as the figure began to move, gliding towards him without a sound. He felt the walls of the alley closing in, the bricks shifting, bending, trapping him as the shadow drew nearer. He could see no eyes, but he felt them, felt their weight, the cold, unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce through him, reading his thoughts, his fears, his deepest secrets. The whisper returned, louder now, insistent, wrapping around his mind like a vice, squeezing until he thought he might break. Ethan, it was his mother's voice, distorted and hollow, echoing off the narrow walls of the alley, filled with a warning he could not understand. His legs refused to move, his body paralyzed with terror, and just as the figure reached out, a hand emerging from the darkness, long fingers stretching towards him, he woke up. Ethan shot up in bed, gasping for air, the echo of the whisper still ringing in his ears. The room was dark, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to creep through the curtains, and he could still smell the turpentine, the metallic tang of the studio. He touched his face, his skin cold and clammy, his heart racing so fast to hurt. It was just a dream, he told himself, but the fear didn't leave. The sense of wrongness lingered, a heavy weight pressing on his chest. Later that day, when he returned to his studio, the unease only grew stronger. The painting was there, exactly as he had seen in the dream, complete, vivid, the shadowy figure now closer, its hand reaching out from the canvas. The detail was flawless, each brushstroke deliberate, every shadow carefully placed. It was his work, and yet it wasn't. The whisper echoed in his mind, the warning he still couldn't understand. The figure seemed to watch him, its presence almost tangible, and as he stood there, staring at his own creation, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer alone. The following nights were worse. Ethan tried to paint as usual, but each stroke felt wrong, his hand unwilling to obey his mind's commands. The air in the studio had changed. It was heavier, charged with something he couldn't quite name, a sense of being watched that gnawed at the edges of his concentration. He could hear the creaks of the old building settling, but the noises seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, like whispers from unseen mouths. One night, he decided to leave his recording equipment running, a small camera perched in the corner, its lens aimed at his easel. He wanted proof that he wasn't losing his mind. He needed to know who or what was touching his work. The studio was cold as he set the camera up, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the settings. The candle on his desk flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move. Just a trick of a light, he told himself, even as a chill ran down his spine. He left the studio, locking the door behind him, and tried to sleep, though the unease twisted inside him like a living thing. The next morning, with a sense of growing dread, Ethan returned to the studio. He found the canvas changed again, more than before. What had been a vague, shadowy figure now had definition. Limbs, fingers stretched unnaturally long, an outline that seemed almost human but was disturbingly off. The face was still absent, a void where features should have been, and the background was more detailed, depicting his own studio in eerie accuracy. With his heart pounding, Ethan rushed to the camera, fumbling as he reviewed the footage. At first, the video showed nothing, just the empty studio, the canvas as he had left it. Hours passed in silence, the frame motionless. But then, just after 3 in the morning, something happened. The air in the room seemed to shift, the candlelight growing dimmer, as if being smothered. And then, the brush moved. No hand held it, but it lifted from the table, dipping into the paint, and slowly, methodically, it began to work on the canvas. Ethan watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the brush moved with deliberate, almost graceful strokes, creating shapes and shadows. It was as if an invisible artist had taken over, working with a purpose Ethan could not understand. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that terrified him even as it compelled him to keep watching. The brush painted the walls, the easel, the very room where it worked, until it painted itself into the canvas, a twisted version of reality that now hung before Ethan in vivid, chilling detail. Suddenly, a noise erupted from the recording, an audible creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening, followed by a whisper. Ethan's name. The brush paused mid-stroke, and then fell, clattering to the floor, the sound echoing unnaturally loud through the studio. The video cut off abruptly, the screen going black. Ethan's hands shook as he replayed the footage, the whisper repeating in his mind, hollow and distant, filled with an unmistakable intent. He could feel it then, standing there in the studio, the weight of eyes on his back, the sense of being watched growing unbearable. Slowly he turned, half expecting to see the shadow from his painting standing in the corner. The room was empty, but the feeling didn't leave. It pressed in on him, the walls seeming to close in, the silence of the studio turning oppressive. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick, the pounding of his heart echoing in his ears. Determined to understand, Ethan approached the canvas, his eyes scanning the new details. There in the background he saw it, his own reflection painted into the window, a faint figure barely visible behind the glass. It was as if he were standing outside, looking in, trapped on the other side. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the dried paint, and the chill of it seeped into his skin, a cold that felt unnatural, as if the painting itself were draining the warmth from him. Suddenly, the studio's door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. Ethan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but the doorway was empty. The hall beyond was dark, the shadows deeper than they should have been, seeming to shift and move as he stared into them. The cold breeze from the open door swept into the studio, extinguishing the candle, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his phone, the light shaky as he illuminated the room, but nothing was there. The door slowly swung shut again, the latch clicking softly, the silence swallowing the sound. Ethan turned back to the canvas, but the sight of it made him freeze. The figure had moved, no longer standing in the background. It was now front and center, its head turned slightly, as if watching him, waiting. He could almost see the outline of a face, a suggestion of eyes, hollow and dark, staring at him from within the painting. Ethan backed away, his pulse racing, a primal fear clawing at his insides. The studio no longer felt like his sanctuary. It felt like a trap, a place where something else was in control. Something that had crossed over from his nightmares into his reality and now refused to leave. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to escape, if only for a moment, to clear his head and figure out what to do next. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, a whisper his name, echoing from the canvas, as if calling him back, as if daring him to look just one more time. Ethan could no longer ignore it. The line between his dreams and reality was disintegrating, and he was standing at the edge of something dark and unknown. Determined to confront whatever was haunting him, he decided to stay in the studio overnight. He had to see it for himself. Whatever invisible force had taken residence in his sanctuary. As midnight approached, the studio seemed to change. The air became colder, the silence thicker, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. He sat in the dim light of a single lamp, the canvas looming before him like an unblinking eye. The brush lay untouched on the table, yet Ethan could almost feel it twitching, eager to be lifted by unseen hands. The shadows on the walls moved subtly, as if shifting closer whenever he wasn't looking directly at them. The minutes dragged on, and exhaustion began to weigh on his eyelids. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling, each noise sounding like a warning. Just as the clock struck 3, the lamp began to flicker. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his pulse quickening as the light dimmed, leaving the room in near darkness. He reached for the lamp, but before his hand could touch it, the light went out completely, plunging the studio into an oppressive, pitch-black void. For a long, tense moment, Ethan sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat, ears straining against the silence. And then he heard it, the soft, rhythmic sound of a brush against canvas, the same sound that had haunted his dreams. A chill spread through Ethan's body, his skin prickling with fear as he turned his head towards the easel. He could see nothing, only the faintest outline of the canvas in the darkness. The scratching continued, deliberate and slow, a sound so intimate it felt like it was happening inside his own head. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to cast some light, his fingers trembling as he turned on the flashlight. The beam was shaky, his fear making it difficult to hold steady, but when he pointed it towards the easel, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The brush was floating, moving with a life of its own, its bristles soaked in dark red paint that glistened in the pale light. It painted feverishly, each stroke adding more detail to the shadowy figure that now dominated the canvas. The figure's arm was extended, fingers outstretched, reaching for something beyond the frame. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, unable to move, the horror of what he was seeing paralyzing him. It was not just paint. It looked like blood, thick and wet, the smell of iron suddenly filling the room. The figure in the painting seemed to grow, expanding beyond the confines of the canvas, the shadows on the wall shifting as if to make room for it. Ethan felt the temperature drop further, the cold sinking into his bones, a sense of dread that wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud. He wanted to run, to get away from whatever this was, but his legs refused to move. The brush dropped suddenly, clattering to the floor, and the sound echoed unnaturally in the silence. Then the figure turned, slowly, its head twisted within the painting, its featureless face aligning to look directly at Ethan. Though it had no eyes, he could feel its gaze, a cold, penetrating force that seemed to bore into his mind, pulling at his thoughts, his fears, as if it were searching for something. Ethan gasped, stumbling backward, the beam of his flashlight swinging wildly across the room. He felt the presence pressing against him, the sensation of invisible fingers brushing against his skin. And then, suddenly, the shadows moved, pouring out from the corners of the studio, rushing towards him. In a panic, Ethan turned, the darkness swirling around him, and he ran. He stumbled through the studio, his shoulders slamming against the doorframe as he reached the exit. The door felt impossibly heavy, as if something were holding it shut, resisting his attempts to escape. He pulled with all his strength, and finally, it gave way, sending him sprawling into the hallway beyond. The air outside was different, warmer, less oppressive, but the fear didn't leave him. He could still feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the darkness of the studio behind him. He turned back, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, its form obscured by shadows, a faceless silhouette that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. It raised an arm, the gesture slow, almost taunting, as if inviting him to return. Ethan didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet and fled, his footsteps echoing through the empty building, the whispers following him, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. His name, distorted, repeated over and over again. When Ethan finally burst out into the night air, he doubled over, gasping for breath, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. The whispers ceased, the cold presence dissipating, leaving him alone beneath the indifferent gaze of the moon. He looked back at the building, the windows of his studio dark and silent, and for a moment, he almost believed he had imagined it all. But his hands were shaking, and there, on his fingertips, was a smear of red paint, fresh, wet, smelling unmistakably of blood. Ethan knew then that whatever was happening, it wasn't just a dream. The darkness had followed him from his sleep into the real world, and it was not going to let him go. The studio had become a portal, a doorway to something beyond his understanding, and whatever he had seen in the painting, it was real. And it wanted him. Ethan had hoped that fleeing the studio would bring him some peace, but the terror had followed him home. The red stain on his fingertips refused to fade, no matter how hard he scrubbed, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had spilled into his waking life. He couldn't sleep, not truly. Every time his eyes closed, he found himself back in that darkened studio, the whispers growing louder, the faceless figure reaching out to him. It was as if the painting had marked him, claimed a part of him that he could never retrieve. Determined to find answers, Ethan returned to the studio the next day, though every step closer felt like approaching the mouth of an abyss. The building loomed before him, its windows dark, an oppressive silence hanging over it like a shroud. He unlocked the door to his studio with trembling hands, half expecting to find a figure waiting for him. But the room was empty. The air was cold, as if no warmth had ever touched it, and the canvas stood exactly where he had left it. Only now, it was different. The painting had changed again. The shadowy figure was still there, but now the setting had shifted. It wasn't just the alley or the ambiguous, shifting background. It was his own apartment. The details were unmistakable. The cracked plaster on the ceiling, the old armchair in the corner, even the half-open window that Ethan always left ajar. The figure stood in the center, its hand resting on the back of his chair, its head turned as if it had just been caught in the act of watching, waiting. Ethan's stomach twisted, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. How could this thing know where he lived? He needed answers, and he needed them now. Frantically, he began to search through the studio, pulling out old sketchbooks, unfinished canvases, anything that might give him a clue. He came across an old journal, one he hadn't touched in years. It was filled with notes from his early days as a painter, scribbles about inspiration, dreams, and techniques he wanted to explore. But there, on one of the last pages, was something he didn't remember writing, a symbol drawn in dark, jagged lines. It was the same mark he had seen on the mysterious paintings, hidden in the corners. A chill ran through him as he realized that the mark had been with him for longer than he thought. Digging further, Ethan found sketches from when he was a child, pages filled with crude drawings of people, animals, places he barely remembered. But on several pages, that same symbol appeared again and again, always in the background, always half hidden, as if it didn't want to be noticed. A memory surfaced of his mother telling him stories about an ancestor, a painter who had gone mad, obsessed with his own work. She had called it a curse, something passed down through the family, but he had always thought it was just a ghost story, something to scare him as a child. Now, the pieces began to come together, each more chilling than the last. The curse was real, and it had latched onto him, using his talent as a gateway. Whatever was haunting him had been waiting, biding its time, until he was vulnerable enough to let it in. The studio wasn't just a place of inspiration. It was a trap, a vessel for something dark that had been lurking in his family for generations. And now, it wanted more than just his art. It wanted his very soul. Desperate, Ethan turned back to the painting, his eyes scanning every inch for more clues. He noticed something he hadn't before, a detail so small it was almost lost in the chaos of shadows and lines. In the reflection of the window in the painting, there was a figure standing outside, barely visible, just an outline. It was him. He was outside, looking in, as if he had been watching the figure from a distance. The realization hit him like a blow, his breath catching in his throat. It was not just a painting of his apartment. It was a scene that was yet to happen, a premonition of what was to come. Suddenly, Ethan remembered the camera, the footage he had taken the night before. He rushed to his bag, pulling out the camera with trembling hands, and began to scroll through the video. The beginning was the same: the empty studio, the candlelight flickering, the slow movement of the brush. But then, as the clock neared 3, something changed. The door to the studio opened, just a crack, and a shadow moved across the floor, slipping inside without a sound. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real, tangible, and it moved towards the canvas, the brush lifting as if guided by unseen fingers. The shadow seemed to pulse, growing darker, more defined, until Ethan could almost make out the shape of a person. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, the terror mounting as he watched the figure reach for the canvas, its head turning slowly towards the camera. For a split second, he saw it, a face, twisted and wrong, with hollow eyes that stared straight into the lens, as if aware it was being watched. And then, the whisper came again, clearer this time, almost mocking. "Ethan." The screen went black, the footage ending abruptly, and Ethan dropped the camera, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He felt the room closing in on him, the shadows creeping along the walls, as if they were alive, reaching for him. This was no longer just a haunting. This was a warning, a threat. The figure knew him, knew everything about him, and it was coming for him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Ethan's eyes snapped to the canvas, the figure now almost seeming to shift in the dim light, its form more solid, more real. He backed away, the overwhelming sense of dread making it hard to breathe, his mind racing for answers. There had to be a way to stop this, to break free from whatever had latched onto him. But as he stood there staring at the painting, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was running out of time, and whatever was coming for him was already closer than he could have ever imagined. Ethan felt as if he were teetering on the edge of madness. The studio had become a place of pure dread, and even his own home no longer felt like a refuge. The whispers, the figure in the painting, it was all too much, and the lines between his dreams and waking life were blurring beyond recognition. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was growing stronger, feeding off his fear, and if he didn't find a way to stop it, it would consume him completely. Ethan remembered Margaret, a local historian he had met years ago, an eccentric woman with a fascination for the macabre and the mysterious. She had once mentioned the history of the building where his studio was, speaking of strange occurrences and the artists who had lived and worked there, each of them falling into obscurity, their work shrouded in mystery. It was a long shot, but Ethan was desperate. He tracked her down, finding her in a dusty little shop on the outskirts of town, surrounded by stacks of old books and relics of a forgotten age. Margaret eyed him with curiosity as he stumbled inside, his eyes wild, his hands shaking. She listened as he told his story, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern as he described the figure, the whispers, the painting that seemed to change on its own. When he showed her the footage from the camera, she grew pale, her eyes narrowing as she watched the shadow move, the brush lifted by an invisible hand. "This is not just a ghost," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something far older, something that has attached itself to you, to your bloodline. The symbol you found, that's a mark of a pact, a deal made long ago. Your ancestor must have promised something in exchange for his talent, and now it's come to collect." Ethan's heart sank. He had always thought the stories his mother told were nothing more than that, stories. But now, it seemed that the curse was real, and it had followed him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Margaret handed him a dusty book, its cover cracked and worn, the pages filled with strange symbols and faded illustrations. "This might help you," she said. "It's a record of the pact, a way to understand what you're dealing with. But be careful, Ethan. This thing feeds on fear, on despair. The more you give it, the stronger it becomes." He took the book, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. The illustrations were disturbing. Figures without faces, shadowy forms reaching out from the darkness, scenes that seemed to mirror his own experiences. One page caught his eye, a depiction of an artist standing before an easel, his reflection in the canvas twisted, monstrous, as if the painting had taken on a life of its own. Beneath the image was a single line, written in an old, spidery script. "To sever the bond, one must confront the truth within." The truth. What truth? Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. He thanked Margaret, her warnings echoing in his ears, as he left the shop, the book clutched tightly in his hands. He knew he had to return to the studio, to face whatever was waiting for him there. The thought filled him with dread, but he had no other choice. If he ran, if he tried to ignore it, the shadow would only grow stronger, and he would lose himself entirely. That night, Ethan returned to the studio, the weight of the book heavy in his bag, the air thick with the sense of something watching. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning like a warning, and he stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The painting was there, unchanged, the figure still standing in his apartment, its hand resting on the chair, its head turned towards him. The longer he looked at it, the more he felt it was not just paint on canvas. It was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to reach out to him, pulling him closer. Ethan opened the book, the pages fluttering as if moved by an unseen breeze, the symbols seeming to shift and writhe on the paper. He found the passage Margaret had shown him, the words almost glowing in the dim light. One must confront the truth within. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt a pull, a compulsion to face the painting, to see beyond the shadows that had consumed his work. Slowly, he approached the easel, his heart pounding, each step echoing in the silence of the studio. The figure seemed to move, its form blurring as he drew nearer, the shadows deepening, growing thicker, until they seemed to spill out of the canvas, pooling at his feet. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, more distinct, his name, repeated over and over, as if urging him to step closer, to give in. And then, he saw it, his own reflection, faint, distorted, within the canvas. It wasn't just a figure that was painted there. It was him, his face, twisted with fear, his eyes hollow, staring back at him from the depths of the painting. The realization hit him like a blow. The shadow wasn't just haunting him. It was a part of him, a manifestation of his own fears, his doubts, the darkness that he had tried to ignore for so long. It had taken root in his art, feeding on his insecurities, growing stronger with each stroke of his brush. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the shadows swirling around him, wrapping around his body like a shroud. Ethan felt a cold hand on his shoulder, the touch freezing, and he turned, expecting to see the figure standing behind him. But there was nothing, only the darkness and the sense of something moving just beyond his sight. He looked back at the canvas, his reflection now clearer, the fear in his eyes replaced by something else: determination. He knew what he had to do. He had to confront it, to face the darkness within himself, to break the hold it had over him. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the canvas, the surface cold and slick beneath his fingers. The shadows writhed, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo, and Ethan closed his eyes, focusing on the truth, on the light that still burned within him, however faint. The cold began to recede, the shadows pulling back, the whispers fading into silence. When he opened his eyes, the studio was still, the painting unchanged, the figure now nothing more than a smear of dark paint on the canvas. Ethan took a deep breath, the weight lifting from his chest, the air feeling lighter, warmer. The presence was still there, lingering, but it was weaker now, its power over him broken. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to hope. He knew this wasn't over. The shadow would always be there, lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. But now he understood it. He had faced it, confronted the truth within himself, and he knew he could fight it. The journey was far from over, but he had taken the first step, and that was enough, for now. Ethan knew he couldn't just stop with a single confrontation. The shadow had weakened, but it was still there, lingering, waiting for its chance to regain control. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel it, just beyond the reach of his conscious mind. He had to end this once and for all, and he needed to find the source of its power, the root of the curse that had haunted his family for generations. The book Margaret had given him spoke of a final confrontation, a moment where the bond could be broken, but it came at a cost. The instructions were vague, filled with cryptic language about facing one's darkest fears and severing the link through an act of sacrifice. Ethan couldn't quite understand what it meant, but the urgency was clear. The shadow would not leave until it had consumed everything he was. He returned to the studio one last time, armed with a book, a can of kerosene, and a box of matches. The only way to break the curse, he reasoned, was to destroy the place where it had taken hold. The studio had become a nest for the darkness, a doorway to something far more sinister, and if he had to burn it down to be free, then so be it. As he entered the studio, a sense of finality settled over him. The air was colder than ever, the silence oppressive, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The painting was there, waiting, the shadowy figure now more defined, its form almost stepping out of the canvas, reaching into the real world. Ethan's heart pounded, fear clawing at the edges of his resolve, but he pushed it down. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He set the book on a table, flipping to the page that detailed the ritual. One must sever the bond through an act of sacrifice, something of value, something that ties the soul to the darkness. Ethan thought about what that could mean, his eyes drawn to the painting. It had taken his art, his passion, and twisted it into something monstrous. His talent, his creativity. That was what the shadow wanted. It had used his work as a vessel, feeding off his fears, and now it had to be destroyed. Ethan opened the can of kerosene, the sharp smell filling the air as he poured it over the floor, the liquid soaking into the wood, splashing onto the easel and the canvas. He could feel the presence growing, the shadows on the walls shifting, growing darker, more solid, as if trying to stop him. The figure in the painting seemed to move, its head turning towards him, its featureless face somehow conveying a sense of rage, of desperation. The whispers began again, louder now, insistent, echoing through the studio, urging him to stop. His hands shook as he struck a match, the small flame flickering in the darkness. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a chorus of voices, some he recognized, his mother, his own voice, twisted and distorted, pleading with him to reconsider. But Ethan knew they were lies, illusions meant to break his resolve. He took a deep breath, the heat of the flame warming his fingers, and then, without hesitation, he tossed the match onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The fire caught quickly, the flames roaring to life, the heat intense as it spread across the room. The shadows recoiled, twisting and writhing as the light consumed them, the whispers turning into screams, angry, desperate, filled with a hatred that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. Ethan stepped back, his eyes fixed on the painting, the figure now engulfed in flames, its form distorting, melting away as the fire ate through the canvas. But as the painting burned, something else happened. The figure didn't just vanish. It stepped out of the canvas, a mass of darkness and flame, its form shifting, struggling against the light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, terror gripping him as the figure advanced, its hollow face now filled with a terrible, yawning void. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall, the heat of the flames searing his skin as the figure reached for him, its fingers elongating, shadows trailing behind them. This was it, the final confrontation. Ethan knew he had to face it, to end it here, or it would never stop. He closed his eyes, focusing on the fear that had plagued him, the doubts, the darkness that had taken root in his soul. He felt the cold touch of shadow, the fingers wrapping around his wrist, the void pulling at him, and in that moment he understood. The sacrifice wasn't the studio or the painting, it was his fear. The shadow thrived on it, grew stronger with every moment of doubt, every whispered insecurity. With every ounce of strength, Ethan opened his eyes, meeting the darkness head-on. He forced himself to step forward, towards the shadow, his heart pounding, the fear still there, but no longer in control. He reached out, his hand passing through the void, and as he did, he felt the connection, an unbreakable thread that bound him to the shadow, a reflection of everything he had ever feared. But instead of pulling away, he embraced it, acknowledging the darkness, the part of himself that he had always tried to deny. The shadow seemed to shudder, the void collapsing in on itself, the darkness fading as the flames roared higher, consuming everything in their path. The figure let out a final, deafening scream, a sound filled with rage and despair, and then it was gone, dissipating into nothing, leaving only the fire, the heat, and the light. Ethan fell to his knees, his body shaking, tears streaming down his face as the weight lifted, the presence finally gone. The whispers were silent, the studio filled only with the crackling of the flames as they consumed the last remnants of the darkness. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling towards the door, the heat unbearable, the smoke filling his lungs. He burst out into the night air, gasping, the cool breeze a welcome relief against his scorched skin. He turned back, watching as the studio burned, the flames reaching high into the sky, the light illuminating the darkness around him. It was over. The shadow was gone, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Ethan felt truly free. But as he stood there, watching the fire, he knew that the darkness would always be a part of him. The shadow had been born from his fears, his doubts, and while he had confronted it, he could never fully escape it. The difference now was that he understood it. He had faced the void and come out the other side, and though the scars would remain, he was stronger for it. The studio was gone, the curse broken, but the journey wasn't over. Ethan turned away from the flames, the whispers gone, replaced by the quiet of the night, and he walked away, ready to begin again, no longer afraid of the shadows that lay within. Ethan walked away from the burning studio, the warmth of the flames still at his back, yet a chill settled into his bones that he couldn't shake. He had faced the darkness and survived, but part of him felt strangely hollow, as if something had been left behind in that inferno, something he could never recover. As he reached his apartment, the night was eerily quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic muted, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was heavy, charged with a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He entered his apartment, locking the door behind him, and took a deep breath. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but they weren't. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, darker than they should have been, and he felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Ethan shook his head, trying to dismiss the paranoia. It was over. He had destroyed the studio, broken the bond, severed the link between himself and the curse. And yet, a nagging feeling remained, a whisper at the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. Ethan turned on every light in his apartment, bathing the rooms in a warm glow, banishing the darkness that seemed to gather at the edges of his vision. He set the book Margaret had given him on the table, its cover now singed and covered in soot, and stared at it. The answers had been within those pages, and while he had followed them to the end, he couldn't help but feel that there was more. Something he had missed, something crucial that still connected him to the shadow. Exhaustion weighed heavy on his body, and he finally collapsed into the armchair in the corner of his living room. His eyes drifted to the window, the same window that had been in the painting. It was open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan frowned. He didn't remember leaving it open, and as he stared, he noticed something strange. The reflection. In the glass, he could see the room behind him, the lights casting long shadows across the walls, but there was something else, something that didn't belong. A figure faint, almost imperceptible, stood at the far end of the room, just out of reach of the light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening as he focused on the reflection. The figure was featureless, a silhouette that seemed to shift and pulse, its form indistinct, like smoke trapped behind the glass. His pulse quickened, fear gripping him once again as he turned, his eyes darting to the corner where the figure should have been standing. But there was nothing there, only empty space, the shadows dancing innocently in the lamplight. He turned back to the window, his heart pounding, and saw the figure again, closer now, its hand outstretched, fingers brushing against the back of his chair. Ethan shot up, the chair tipping over as he stumbled backward, his eyes locked on the reflection. The figure remained motionless, its head slowly tilting as if acknowledging him, a silent watcher that had never truly left. A whisper, so soft it could have been his imagination, echoed through the room, his name, drawn out, taunting. Ethan backed away, his hands trembling as he reached for the light switch. He flicked it off, plunging the room into darkness, then immediately switched it back on, the light flooding the room once more. The figure was gone, the reflection now showing only the empty room behind him. He let out a shaky breath, his chest tight, the fear still clawing at his insides. It wasn't over. The thought echoed through his mind, a chilling realization that settled over him like a shroud. Whatever he had faced in the studio, whatever he had destroyed, it was only a part of the whole. The shadow was still with him, still lurking, waiting for another moment of weakness to reclaim what it had lost. Ethan understood now that this wasn't something he could simply destroy. It was a part of him, a darkness that had always been there and always would be. The studio had been the battleground, but the war was far from over. Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the window. He could still see the faint outline of his own reflection, distorted by the imperfections in the glass, and for a moment he thought he saw the shadow again, just a flicker, a suggestion of movement. He blinked, and it was gone, but the unease remained. He knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't allow the darkness to fester in the familiar corners of his home. He had to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of whatever was hunting him. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Ethan made his decision. He would leave the apartment, the city, everything he knew. He would find a way to stay ahead of the darkness, to keep it at bay, whatever it took. But deep down, he knew the truth. There would be no escape, no true freedom from the shadow that had claimed him. It was a part of his soul, a reflection of the fears he carried, and no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, watching, waiting. If you found Ethan's journey as chilling as I did, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. This is just the beginning. There are more stories to tell, more shadows lurking just out of sight, waiting for their moment to step into the light. And if you think you know how Ethan's story might end, leave a comment below. Is there any way for him to truly escape the darkness? Or is he destined to be haunted forever? The answers might be closer than you think. But are you ready to face them?